Space, the final frontier. This is the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. Its mission to explore the solar system, to seek out new observations and data, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now the host of the Observer's Notebook, Tim Robertson.
Hello and welcome to episode 164 of The Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. I'm Tim Robertson, the host of The Observer's Notebook and also the coordinator of the training program within the ALPO. Thanks for downloading and listening. The ALPO collects and analyzes observations of various solar system bodies and associated phenomena, and publishes detailed reports concerning these bodies in its quarterly publication, The Journal of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. This podcast depends upon donations from you, our listeners, to keep it going. If you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, you can donate to it via Patreon. You can start by giving as little as $1 a month. If you feel even more generous, for $5, you receive early access to the podcast before it goes public. For a monthly donation of $10, you receive a copy of the Novice Observer's Handbook. And for $35 a month, you receive producer credits on the podcast. You can help us out by going to www.patreon.com/observersnotebook. And if you'd like to join the ALPO, membership starts at only $22 a year. Find out more at www.alpo-astronomy.org. And you can also find the ALPO on Facebook. Just search for ALPO Astronomy. And this podcast also has a Facebook page as well. Just search for Observer's Notebook. And if you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, please subscribe. That way you'll never miss another episode. And now, episode 164. And we're going to the Vatican. Enjoy. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody back to this edition of the Observer's Notebook podcast, and we are continuing on our Historic Observatories series, and today we're at the Vatican, talking to Paul Gabor from the Vatican Observatory. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Good morning.
Yeah, now before we start talking about the observatory, why don't you give a little bit of background about yourself?
I started out studying particle physics. Then I joined the Jesuits, so I did philosophy and theology, and after that I did a doctorate in astrophysics, so I kind of did a little bit of a zigzag there. And I've been with the Vatican Observatory since 2010.
Okay. Now, how did you become interested in astronomy?
Oh, my. Well, I guess I was interested in astronomy as a kid, but I didn't actually pursue it until much later in life. As I've said, I was more into particle physics, high energy physics. So the astronomy orientation was also a little bit in that direction because I was doing instrumentation in particle physics, and that's kind of what I did also for my doctorate in astrophysics.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the observatory. Now, where is the observatory located?
So the observatory has two locations, two main locations, so to speak. So one is just outside of Rome, the papal summer residence of Castel Gandolfo.
Okay.
And the other one is in Tucson, Arizona. Now, I need to say that the reason for that is light pollution, primarily. Because first, of course, the Vatican Observatory was actually in Rome. In the 1930s, this new headquarters were built in Castel Gandolfo on the roof of the papal palace, and then later in the gardens as well. So there are 4 domes there. And already in the 1960s, it became obvious that the light pollution in Castel Gandolfo was also fairly bad. And so we started looking for another site, first in Italy. And then in 1978, Father George Coyne became director of the Vatican Observatory. And he was a professor at the University of Arizona. So he said, well, why don't we just establish some kind of a collaborative relationship with the University of Arizona and use their facilities to do our observational work. So that's what happened. And we essentially ended up here starting in 1981. So it's been quite a long presence. And in the late 1980s, we got an offer to use the prototype mirror, which was first to be made using this new technique of spin casting,
right?
And to build a telescope around it. So that's what happened. So this year we'll be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the dedication of our 6-foot, 1.8 meter telescope, which is on Mount Graham. That's not quite in town. It's about 4 hours drive from campus.
Okay. Yeah, when I started this series of historic observatories, I was asked about doing the Vatican Observatory. And I thought, well, I'll have to brush up on my Italian, but I found out what you guys are doing is in Arizona. That's pretty wild. That just surprised me. Yeah. So
actually, not many people know about our presence here. But the astronomical community is relatively cognizant. But
right.
Let's say the good Catholics of Arizona quite frequently are a little surprised.
Yeah. Now, how about let's go back in time when the Vatican Observatory first began. Can you talk about that?
Well, let's say the first incarnation of the Vatican Observatory was a byproduct of the Papal Committee for the Reform of the Calendar, which was established in 1572. And in 1582, 10 years later, the new calendar, the calendar which we call the Gregorian calendar, was promulgated by Pope Gregory XIII. And in the process, in those 10 years, a tower, an observational tower was built in the Vatican. This was a pre-telescope era, of course. First telescope was used for astronomy in 1609. We're talking about the 1570s. So 40, 50 years earlier. And essentially the observational tower is still there. It's fairly tall. It's about 70 meters or so. And it hasn't really been used for astronomical purposes since the early 20th century. It was used on and off for that purpose. Then the Vatican Observatory, or the Papal Observatories in Rome and in the Papal States, went through several iterations. There were pontifical observatories in Rome itself, at the Gregorian College. The Gregorian University was called Roman College at the time, the Jesuit university in Rome, and so basically these different versions of the Vatican Observatory were there, organically developing basically as a part of the Papal States. When Italy took Rome in 1870, the two pontifical observatories in Rome were also taken over by the Kingdom of Italy, and they became the Observatory of Rome. So the Vatican needed to establish an observatory at the Vatican, and that happened formally in 1891. And so that is the date of foundation of our particular version of the Vatican Observatory, 1891, and that's also the date of our mission statement. So it's a little bit out of date, you could say.
Wow. So what changes have you seen over the years with the observatory?
Well, we fairly fortunate because we do have a relatively stable influx of new people, so that's essentially what is going on. It's a small group, so maybe 10 research astronomers.
Okay.
And basically, since that mission statement I mentioned says that the observatory's mission, excuse me, the observatory's mission is to do astronomical research and show the world that clergy can do astronomy. That means that we actually have to have our staff recruited from amongst the clergy, in particular from among Jesuits. And so this is obviously a little bit of a constraint on our recruitment. So essentially, unlike many other institutions where you recruit people according to the research program that your institution already pursues, and you want to bolster that, we essentially recruit people and then we figure out what research they want to do. So
a little backwards there.
It's a little bit backwards from that point of view, yes.
Wow.
So yeah, we have people who are interested in solar system bodies, people who do cosmology, people who do even string theory. So it's a very varied group, and therefore our collaborations are mostly outside of our institution.
Okay. Yeah, there's a misconception. I think you'd agree that religion and science don't always see hand in hand with this, and to say that the Vatican is doing true science, that dispels a lot of that thought, don't you think?
Yeah, I guess that's the main reason why we even exist as an institution supported by the Vatican City State. Yeah, we are, aside from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is not a research institute, but we are kind of the only scientific body within the Vatican. And some people have argued that, in principle these days it would probably be a better idea to have something in, let's say, molecular biology or something like that. But historically speaking, astronomy has been around for a long time, and so that's probably the reason why the Vatican is still supporting an observatory as opposed to something else, to demonstrate this positive attitude towards science. But the idea that science and religion are in conflict is a relative newcomer. It's basically a late 19th century phenomenon, and it had to do with various incarnations of culture wars. In Europe, it took a different form. In Italy, in particular, there was a big struggle between church and state over education, over the school system. In the United States, it was different, and I don't want to go into that. So anyway, the reason why Pope Leo XIII in 1891 established the Vatican Observatory with that particular mission statement was precisely this context of a culture war over the school system in Italy. So,
yeah, and I don't know. Part of my early education in astronomy dealt with Galileo, and there's fact and there's myth about what happened with Galileo and the church as well. Can you talk about that at all?
Sure. Well, I'm not a professional historian, but I dabble a little bit because I teach history of astronomy and philosophy of science at the University of Arizona. So it's a topic that has been studied quite extensively over the last few decades by historians, and they came up with a very good portrait of the whole cultural context. And essentially what happened with Galileo you could say, had more to do with the establishment of the day than with the church somehow as an institution opposing science. That's not really what was going on there. It had more to do with politics, more to do with things like losing face and the position of Galileo as a courtier, and his relationship with Pope Urban VIII, who was regarded as a patron. This patron-client relationship is something that we don't quite understand today because it's a little alien to us. And essentially, what appears to have happened is that Galileo did something which was really regarded as a slap in the face of the Pope. So the Pope and Galileo actually discussed this second book of his, this book of his, quite extensively, which is fairly rare for the Pope to discuss a book over, I think, 5 meetings with an author. And that is fairly well documented historically, that they had these 5 talks about the dialogue on the 2 systems of the world. And the Pope was generally pleased with the book. He just wanted a paragraph added to the conclusion of the book. And everybody knew that. Unfortunately, Galileo decided that to publish the book without that paragraph the Pope drafted, and so that couldn't have resulted in anything very positive for Galileo, because essentially, because everybody knew about this, it was an affront to the Pope as a patron. And so he basically used the whole machinery at his disposal to show Galileo his displeasure. And so you could say that the Pope was petty, but that's not necessarily the case. It's more to do with losing face again. So this is it's a different era.
Oh yeah.
And but anyway, at the time, it wasn't really regarded as a problem of the church and science. It was regarded primarily as a problem of Galileo himself. And it only became interpreted as an example of how the church persecuted science much later.
That's the feeling I had too going in. When I first started looking into Galileo, because I've done a little bit of research on Galileo as well, and it's interesting how that little incident, however little it was, has really progressed. A lot of the feeling about the church and science sometimes. So it's pretty.
Yeah, the whole history is fairly convoluted and complicated, but generally speaking, mainstream Christianity, Catholicism in particular, has been fairly open towards the contemplation of creation as a path to God. There is this doctrine of the 2 books, which has been around for quite a while, and different authors have expanded on it, and it has never really been on the forefront, and so I wouldn't be surprised if some people have never heard of it. The idea is that God wrote 2 books, the book of creation and the book of scripture, and since both of these books have the same author, they can't be in contradiction. But it also means that the book of creation contains quite a lot of theological content, which is an interesting point. So in other words, you could learn a lot about God by doing science. And this idea is already present in the letter to the Romans, I believe, in a kind of not a particularly prominent spot, but it's still there. And it was later developed by some of the church fathers, and then the classic book about this was published in 1436, if I'm not mistaken, by Raymond Sebundus. So, and that book is called on the Book of Creatures, I think.
Okay.
So anyway, it's a topic that's been around in an approach, if you like, that's been around in theology for a while, and this idea that science shouldn't be regarded as something suspicious is something that's been around. So I think the source of the truth, right, is kind of what's disputed here sometimes, and there are some people and some religions, some brands of Christianity included, that say that all you need to know is in the Bible. But that's not really what the Bible says either, because if you think about it, the Bible tells us that God wants to be close to people and wants to be known by people. So why would he limit himself to the Holy Writ? There could be many other ways how God can show himself and his message, etc., to people. And it doesn't have to be this particular channel. It could be perhaps a certain privileged channel, maybe, but that doesn't mean it's the only one. And I don't really see how you could be, in the line of what the Bible itself says, and say that only the Bible contains God's revelation.
Yeah, very good, very good. Now, the observatory itself, how is it funded? Is it private funding?
Well, both. It has funding from the Vatican City State.
Okay.
And especially what concerns the telescope in Arizona, there is a 501c3 called the Vatican Observatory Foundation, incorporated in the state of Arizona, that helps us support our mission here.
And that's, you guys work real close with the University of Arizona, right?
We do, yes. Essentially, the university still owns the primary mirror of our telescope. Oh. And this is reflected then in a stakeholdership kind of agreement we have with them. So the stake they have on the telescope, on the observing time, but also on the operational costs is 1/4 as opposed to 3/4 as ours.
Okay. So you split telescope time with them as well, then?
Correct, yes. It's a little more than just the University of Arizona, because, in fact, there is no such thing, legally speaking. There are the universities of Arizona. So the state of Arizona is the partner here.
Okay. What other affiliations does the Vatican Observatory have?
Affiliations?
Yes. With other organizations or?
Well, as such, we do have various MOUs regarding various particular things. So we have an instrument which is on long-term loan from the National University of Ireland in Galway, and we have what should I call it? What we are part of a consortium of Catholic universities called, I forgot what it's called actually. There is an acronym. But anyway, so these are things that concern the institution as such.
Okay. And
then there are these collaborative arrangements we have regarding various research projects. So those are also fairly often somehow regulated using MOUs and agreements and contracts and so on. So, for instance, we had a collaborative project with the Astrophysics Institute in Potsdam, just outside of Berlin, in Germany. And I'm speaking about in the past tense because the data taking stage of it is over. Now we're just on the brink of publication of the first batch of results, and then the second complete set of results will be published probably in a year or two.
Okay.
So that's just one example of many.
Okay. What type of instrumentation, observing equipment does the observatory have?
Well, we basically have two instruments at the telescope: the 4K imaging camera, and a spectrograph with a resolution of a few thousand. So the Galway instrument I mentioned before is something which is also available, and it's sometimes used. That's a fast imager. We're currently working on upgrades to the telescope, and also we are probably going to acquire a new camera. It's a general purpose imaging camera. So things are in motion, but when it comes to our telescope and its location, it's 10,500 feet. The air tends to be fairly dry, so it's a good spot for all kinds of astronomy that you wouldn't be able to do elsewhere. Right. So this telescope, although it is only 1.8 meters, because of the location, actually can do a little more than you would expect. And it is designed around that primary mirror, which, as I've said, was a prototype. So the optics of the telescope are a little strange from that point of view. Because it was a prototype, it was a demonstrator of a technology, and it was simply chosen to have an f/1 focal ratio, which of course makes quite a lot of the optical applications a little difficult to do without corrector plates, etc. So our field of view, which is reasonably flat, is about 15 arc minutes, and because of the location, etc., the selling point of our telescope mainly is photometry. So we do various types of projects that focus on various types of differential photometry and sometimes absolute photometry as well. Okay. The spectrograph, on the other hand, can be also used, obviously, because we have it, and it was optimized for stellar classification. It would be a good instrument for, let's say, bad weather, bad seeing, but at the moment we don't really have the ability to swap between the instruments without actually doing an instrument change. So from that point of view, we might do that as a part of these longer term upgrades to the facility, to have the ability to switch instruments on the fly, but we don't have that ability yet. So
Okay. So what are some of the science programs going on there now?
Well, we have one very long term project that looks at open clusters. This has been going on for 35 years, perhaps, because it predates the telescope. And that is using a special filter set called the Vilnius filters, and it allows you to figure out pretty much everything you want to know about an open cluster. So because it can differentiate between various types of redshift, including the reddening induced by dust, and so you can classify the stars in a cluster. You can therefore tell what the age of the cluster is, etc. So we've been collecting data on these clusters for a very long time, and the applications of that, or the potential for this data has been improved now with Gaia, because it goes a little beyond Gaia, and it will also be something that will be very useful in the era of the Vera Rubin survey telescope. So anyway, this is one project. Then we are involved in a collaboration with the University of Arizona, with the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, and with the National Central University in Taipei, in a project that looks at transits of exoplanets. So I think there are 6 or 7 telescopes involved in that project, and essentially what we are looking at are late M dwarfs, so M6 through M9, and basically we are, I think, already at the point where we can claim that we've exhaustively looked at the habitable zones of these objects within 15 parsecs of the solar system. So that was one project that is still ongoing. The project I mentioned with the Potsdam Astrophysics Institute, that was a project that was a spectroscopic characterization, a detailed characterization of rather bright stars in the North Ecliptic Pole region, sort of preemptively looking at these objects, because that is where the TESS survey is making the most passes, and therefore there is the best chance that there will be some interesting planets discovered there. So what we're trying to do is characterize the potentially host stars of those planets, and we are doing that not with our spectrograph, but we're doing it with the PEPSI spectrograph, the Potsdam Eschel polarimetric spectroscopic instrument, which is one of the greatest spectrographs in the world today. And it just so happens that it is in the base of the pier of the Large Binocular Telescope, which is on Mount Graham. And so we have a fiber link taking the light collected by our telescope to that very high resolution spectrograph. And when I'm saying very high resolution, I'm talking about 250 to 300,000 range.
My goodness.
And the spectrograph obviously only receives, after a third of a mile or so of fiber, only receives the red light. The blue light is lost in the fiber, but it still is enough to determine quite a lot of interesting things about the host stars, about the chemical composition, especially various types of heavier elements obviously present. And so the potential correlation between the presence of these elements and the presence of planets can be studied. anyway, so this was another project that's going on. And last but not least, let me just say that the telescope is also used, especially through the Arizona Time Allocation Committee, that is to say that through the 3 universities of Arizona, for student work. So graduate students use our telescope for their projects.
Okay.
And that is a great way to use the telescope. The graduate school at the University of Arizona is one of the largest in the nation, and essentially it has this long-term tradition of allowing people to take their own data. So, a graduate from the Arizona, the University of Arizona graduate school tends to be a little more hands-on than your average PhD in astrophysics.
Interesting. Now, is there public outreach programs and programs like that?
Well, yes, we are obviously involved in that. The problem with the telescope as such is that it is at a remote location, right, and the access to it is controlled by the permit we have, the university has from the United States Forest Service, and so any visitors to the telescope have to go through the Eastern Arizona College, okay, which is a community college style institution in Safford, Arizona, on the foot of the mountain, and they organize tours.
Okay.
Usually May through October, and on Fridays and Saturdays you can inquire there as to okay, what are the plans. So essentially, when we do outreach, it is not directly linked to our facilities. We do outreach by giving talks, by having summer schools, having various workshops and so on. But and of course publications. But we don't really have let's say a visitor center or something like that. But there is, if you if you want to go to Castel Gandolfo, there is a way to to visit there through the Vatican museums.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've been to the Vatican a few times. It's an impressive place, I'll tell you that.
Have you been to Castel Gandolfo?
I don't know where that's at.
Oh, so you haven't? Yeah, it's
I've been
not very far from Rome.
Okay.
It's only about 18 miles or so.
Okay.
But it does take a while to get there, usually, because of traffic and, generally speaking, the way things are arranged there. So you can take a train or you can drive. It basically comes down to the same amount of time. So from downtown Rome to Castel Gandolfo, it's about an hour.
Okay.
Whatever you do, and short of taking a helicopter. And, so it's a very, very nice spot. It used to be the villa of the Emperor Domitian in the 1st century, and then it went through many owners, and since in fact since the same pope that became so infamous because of his contentious relationship with Galileo, Urban VIII, that was when a huge chunk of that property was added to the papal holdings, and so essentially for the last 400 years or so, there's been the papal summer residence of one of them, and after Italy took over the papal states, this has been the only papal summer residence. So it's really a pretty spot, and it has these 4 domes I mentioned earlier, with one telescope that predates the Vatican Observatory but by a few years, let's say a couple of years. The Quart du Ciel telescope. I don't know whether you are familiar with the Quart du Ciel project. It was the first international collaboration where people, 22, I think, observatories around the world divided the celestial sphere into zones, and they undertook this photographic mapping of the sky. And they used standard telescopes for it. So all 22 observatories have the same telescopes made by, two companies, but according to the same plan. So the Vatican Observatory has been involved in that in the 1890s. And the telescope is there, and it's actually been restored very nicely. So we use it for star parties. Because it has one of its two tubes is a kind of a finder scope, so it's optically the same as the other tube, which is used for the actual photography. So these 4-inch photographic plates go on the other side of the tube, but the side which is used as a finder scope is great because it's a refractor. So you can, with a focal length of, I don't know, something like 10 feet. So it's nice to use for a star party. And then we have 2 telescopes. They're from the 1930s, Carl Zeiss Jena telescopes. Again, one of them can be used for great star parties. It's a little more cumbersome to use because that has a focal length of about 4.5 meters, I think. Oh. So it's another refractor, and then we have a telescope from the 1950s, Schmidt camera, which unfortunately we basically abandoned around 1990, simply because in order to use it these days, you'd really have to rebuild the focal plane. You would need to build some kind of a large imaging array for it, and it really wouldn't make too much sense to do it with the level of light pollution in that location. So, yeah, it's sad. We even looked into donating it and transporting it somewhere, but it would actually be cheaper to build a new telescope. So it's just sitting there doing nothing much. It's a shame, though. Yeah. Maybe one day somebody will come up with an idea how to use it.
So what are some of the future plans for the Vatican Observatory?
Well, so the telescope here in Tucson, or rather in southern Arizona and Mount Graham, is going to celebrate its 30th anniversary of dedication. So it is high time to move it to another level, and we are going to do that. We have a contract with a company that will overhaul its encoders, its drives and everything. So it will allow us to run fully remotely with nobody present at night on site, and we'll also be able to run the telescope in scripted mode. So this means that we will probably be able to use the telescope, offer the telescope to our collaborators in Europe. Of course, we could use it ourselves from Castel Gandolfo, but other people could use it too during daytime, which is nice. The other upgrade to the telescope that is hopefully going to follow pretty much immediately after this upgrade to the mount control system, is this new camera, which will have similar parameters to the current one when it comes to the field of view, and the pixel size and so on, but it will be a modern camera, so it will probably have much reduced readout times. We could probably go for a CMOS. We haven't made a determination of that yet. We are just in the process of starting the work of an ad hoc science advisory committee that will help us select a camera for the telescope. So with various science cases competing for different specific features. So hopefully we'll have the camera and the telescope overhauled around the same time in 2024, so next year. And then the next step after that would be what I already hinted at, to essentially rebuild or build a new instrument interface that would allow us to swap instruments on the fly. That could be another way how to optimize the time on the telescope so that we can have
more efficiency. Yeah.
Different projects available for different kinds of atmospheric conditions.
Okay.
So that would be the step after that. But we shall see exactly where that goes and where the astronomy goes in particular. Of course, these days with time domain astronomy and with follow-up, it's very important to be ready. Mm-hmm. In particular, we are part of, through the University of Arizona, of the follow-up network for gravitational gravitational wave detections, and we have we're trying to make sure that the telescope and its operational modes are compatible with projects like that.
Fascinating. Wow, Paul, this has been amazing. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. Do you have any?
You're welcome.
Do you have any other information I could share with our audience?
Well, I think if there is one message I would like to emphasize, it's the importance of dark sky protection. Essentially, the story of our migration to the Wild West, so to speak, to Arizona has been driven by light pollution,
right?
Which is not that we have anything to regret about our relationship with the University of Arizona. On the contrary,
right.
Been very productive. But I have to emphasize that we were fortunate that we had this option to find a location that welcomed us and allowed us to thrive here. But there are many institutions that essentially in a fixed location, and the utility of their instruments is sadly diminished by light pollution. And these days, of course, the various satellite constellations.
Yeah. Don't get me started on that.
Yeah. So anyway, we've been actually involved in one capacity or another with some of the key people in the area of dark sky protection. Tucson, as you know, is the birthplace and headquarters of the International Dark Sky Association, but also the National Observatory, which used to be known as the NOAO and now is the NOI Lab, has its headquarters just across the road from Stewart Observatory on campus of the University of Arizona, and there is a group there that has been very active in promoting dark sky protection. So it's it's an important part of I think our mission to be good astronomical citizens, so to speak, and then try to promote the awareness and the protection of dark skies. So,
very well said. Very well said. Well, Paul, I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Observer's Notebook podcast. Again, I want to thank Father Paul Gabor for coming on the podcast today to talk to us about the Vatican Observatory. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. We upload a new episode of the Observer's Notebook on the 1st and 15th of every month. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. If you do, please rate and review us. I would really appreciate it. You can also listen to us on Apple Radio, iHeartRadio, Soundcloud, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, Amazon, Echo, Spotify, and also on the ALPO YouTube channel. You can help support the podcast by donating to it via Patreon by giving up to $35 a month, where you will receive 1 year's membership to the ALPO and producer credits on the podcast. And with that, I want to thank the producers of this podcast, Steve Siedentop and Michael Moyer, for their generous support of the Observer's Notebook. The link for Patreon as well as the link for the ALPO is in the show notes. If you'd like to get a hold of me, my email address is commentman@commentman.net or on Twitter at ObserversNBpod. And until next time, my hope is you always have clear and steady skies. Thanks for listening.